because of your extraordinary and illustrious career, I mean, there's so much I'd like to talk to you about.
Okay, you're kind. Okay.
You know, um, you know, being mayor, your track record in D.C., statehood. I'd love to. I talk a great deal about people's families. So I'm fascinated about your impressions of the '60s. So at some point, if we could get a half hour today and maybe another hour at some point, whenever you have time.
Okay, that sounds good.
Okay. So what I'd like to do, Mayor, is just talk about. I'm always fascinated with people's beginnings, their foundations, their parents, grandparents, their mentors and champions. The people that sort of inspired them, and obviously when you move forward in terms of your leadership, I call it sort of the birth of leadership. So would it be okay to talk about
Sure.
the family and the foundations?
Sure.
Wonderful.
So I was born in Washington, D.C. At a time that it was still really quite segregated. And in fact, I was born at what is now known as Howard University Hospital. But even at that time, it was still Freedman's Hospital. It tells you something about, the energy of this city.
Yes.
My parents, I had a few generations in DC, and a lot of people, I guess, in my family worked for the federal government, but my father didn't want to do that, and he was eventually a lawyer and a judge and so forth. Coming up, I was very well aware, even though I was in a very protected community, Washington, D.C. had, because it had such a significant Black population, and maybe because it was so segregated, we had a lot of support systems, and we had a lot of mentors and role models because we all sort of lived together. That world began to change when I was still in elementary school. I know for younger people, they'll think, my God, you're ancient, but when the 54 decision occurred around Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka, and my father and our family moved, shortly after that to a neighborhood where we could go to an integrated school. It was an eye-opener for me because I never knew that they had grass on a playground until we got to an integrated. I thought everybody had concrete. I should add it because it's very significant. We lost our mother, my sister and I have a sister 2.5 years younger, to cancer when we were very, very young. So that had an impact because my Benny and I had to sort of be moved about. We had a terrific grandmother and aunt, my father's mother and sister. And fortunately for us, that aunt is still with us. She's 101. So isn't that something?
That
and
is.
But at any rate, my father remarried and we moved to this neighborhood. And that, we were part of sort of that generation that began to sort of push the doors open as a result of the 54 decision. I had a lot of role models. I was lucky. I mean, by the time I was in high school, and I had a great homeroom teacher whose husband was the dean of, what was he? The dean student affairs at Howard. Okay. Mrs. Blackburn, her husband was a big to-do, and actually they have a building at Howard named after him. She very much nurtured my interest in, which I had always, in politics, history. I mean, as a kid, I only read books about biographies, history. You're in a city where the industry of the town is politics, but we in the District of Columbia had no access to it whatsoever. And we knew a part of that denial had everything to do with race. So that I won't go on and on. You can, I can keep going, but
no, please do, because
okay. So, when by the time I got into high school, I really, really had a real interest by then of real wanting to participate in politics in some way. And I think a lot of it was just as a person who was born in Washington, D.C., I so resented that we were marginalized in this way, and I wanted to do something about it. And so by the time I entered Howard, I was quite determined to figure out a path to do something about it. I was lucky again. The Dean of Women was Patricia Roberts Harris. So that was a magnificent role model. I mean, she's a very, there were only a handful of women lawyers, Black women lawyers. And I happened to have one of the best as the Dean of Women. and a mentor. And of course, Howard had a lot of wonderful exemplars. My humanities instructor was Toni Morrison. You know, the head of sociology department was E. Franklin Frazier. You know, we just had an explosion of talent on Howard University's campus, you know, and they had a lot of not debates, but there was a group called the Little Forum that the head of the philosophy department, Dr. Banner, established. And, you know, in that group was Stokely Carmichael. I think Stokely was a year ahead of me at Howard. But, you know, those were just the halcyon days at Howard University in that era. And so partly because of Patricia Roberts Harris, partly because of just my own drive, I stayed with the issue around political enfranchisement for Washington, D.C. So in my second year as a political science major, not surprising, political science major at Howard, I was chosen to be a Falk Fellow in politics. And I chose the topic of home rule for the district, statehood for the district, and started meeting with people at the White House. Lyndon Johnson was the president, and they were very nice. You know, they welcomed me to the White House to talk about it and to learn more about why they took a position and what they thought together we could do. So that, you know, that continued to reinforce that interest and reaffirm that it was people would listen to you. Whether we could get something done is another story, but at least, you know, I wasn't knocking on a door where no one answered. They welcomed me to come to the White House and talk about it.
So let me ask you this, Mayor. So going back, and you talked about, you know, you were one of the first to integrate your, I guess it was like junior high school, high school.
It was an elementary school.
Elementary school.
Yeah.
Do you recall what that feeling was like in terms of interacting? Because I'm assuming you didn't spend a lot of time with white kids growing up prior to that, correct?
No, I had never really interacted with white kids. I was entering the sixth grade when we integrated. And I think there was only about 3 of us in that class, probably in each class, at best, 3 Blacks.
And what was that like? Do you recall?
You know, I in one instance in a physical fight, my sister, who was in the 3rd grade, had to come and save me. So, but you know, in another way, they chose me as the one who just to be the one to deliver the speech for the senior class. You know, is an interesting contradictions there. Part of it was the teacher said, well, each of the students would write an essay about a topic of interest. And for whatever reason, I chose atomic energy because there was so much, you know, still people had exercises, jumping under the desk, so forth. And I talked about how it could be harnessed for power, you know, electricity. Why I thought of that, why I had zeroed in on that, I don't know. Maybe I knew later I'd work for Electric Power Company. I don't know. So it was such an unusual topic for a 6th grader. They chose me to deliver the speech for the graduating class. So in one instance, we had fistfights about being called names and a unwelcoming attitude, and on the other hand, chosen to give the class speech. What I want to dial back and say, and I do think this is true, growing up in a segregated environment with lots of wonderful role models and lots of people reaffirming you, you almost don't hear them when they call you these things. You know, when they say these terrible things, at one point you sort of turn around and say, well, who are you talking about? Because you have been so imbued with a sense of your own self-worth.
Yes.
And I do think that is one of the advantages. And I had actually a friend of mine from Cincinnati was saying that the other day. She said, you know, Sharon, I think there was an advantage, you know, as against, because we really had such a sense of confidence. We really did. And so when they said these things, we thought they were just crazy. They're just absurd, they're misguided. And so, and I think that attitude carried through from junior high school to high school. The truth is, by the time you got to the end of junior high, it was de facto segregation again because white flight, But,
Yeah.
and I think throughout my life, I've never, and I don't think I'm unusual in this regard. I just never, when people say these things, I just think, God, they're so misguided. So
So
it
do you,
didn't, it was there. You do learn to be forever aware of it, and you learn about it as a child. There's the sort of attitude, you still see it in this a television series, Gilded Age, where as a Black person and you're walking down the street and when white people step, there was a level of some tension about how you could look at them, whether you could, look back in their face and whether you should step aside for them. There was that, it was that environment. The environment was impregnated with those prejudices and those anxieties, I should say, because though we were very confident, we were also very aware of our marginalized role, in the city.
yeah.
So, yes, I was aware that I was a Black person in America and that was a challenge. But on the other hand, I thought they were misguided for thinking that was a problem.
So do you remember the first time, whether it was your father or your mother or your aunt or your grandmother, sort of, especially when you're going into sixth grade, um, talking about being Black in America? Now, maybe you'd had that discussion before, but now you were going to be, integrating with white kids. Do you remember those conversations, Mary?
Well, I think we had those conversations all the time. I mean,
Hmm.
that just going ongoing commentary about who, my grandmother would talk about how she got paid one thing and everybody else, as a Black person and other people at the government printing office got paid something else. How they wouldn't get, well, my aunt, my mother died, would take us shopping and you couldn't go and sit down and eat.
Right.
She would have to go in and you had to get the hot dog or whatever it was and carry it out for Benny and me because we couldn't sit down. So it was, you all the time you have that conversation. And so, my father was very excited. I don't remember it as well as my sister that when the 54 decision occurred, he gathered us and we were in elementary school now, and he pulled out a bottle of champagne and said, we're going to toast this decision. Um, and, they didn't tell us to be nervous. They just told us to go for it.
Yeah.
And but we certainly knew from day-to-day experiences, day-to-day conversations, that you had to be careful because if you went to a certain part of Maryland or a certain part of Virginia, you could be in serious physical trouble. So you needed to be ever aware.
So I'm curious, in terms of your father and your grandmother, where were their roots? And they obviously were in
My
Washington.
grandmother and I think my paternal grandmother and grandfather were born in Washington, D.C. And my father and aunt, and no, my father and aunt were born in Washington, D.C. My mother was born in St. Paul, Minnesota. When her mother and her sister and she came to Washington, in part because of the educational system,
Okay.
to go to Francis Junior High School and then Dunbar High School. And then I think that's where she met my father. And my grandmother went to what was then called M Street High School, which later became Dunbar High School, and then had, limited education beyond high school. But she was a very smart woman. I think it was very frustrating to her that, such as limited options, limited opportunities. But yeah, I had I had a few generations who lived in the city.
That's fascinating. I mean, that in and of itself, great stories about early Washington, D.C. must have been fascinating for you to hear if they talked about it. But that's quite interesting. So,
Yeah, the DC has, in fact, we're working now in the place where I am now, a sort of to chronicle that history because it's a very important history.
yes.
And race has always defined this city, in part as we discover, as we go back and look at the history of why they established the Capitol along the banks of the Potomac, we discover that, as Hamilton musical said, in the room where it happened because Jefferson, Madison, Washington, and others wanted it, the capital, in a slave trading community. They did not want it in Pennsylvania, where the Quakers were so prevalent and who were such abolitionists. So race-based slavery and the vestiges of race-based slavery just was, hung in the air like the humidity in Washington, D.C. It has always, and even though we had that burst and moment where they called it Chocolate City, and there was a sense of great political empowerment, and there was a great electricity in the city when we finally got home rule. There's no question about it. Just people of great talent and who, ambition sort of came out of the woodworks to be a part of this moment. But the biases, the prejudices still exist.
Yes.
In 2022. I mean, it still exists. That maybe, well, I would say less obvious here, but not so much less obvious in the country.
Yes. So tell me then about the 60s. So you graduate high school 62. Tell me then about your decision to go to Howard. Were there now excuse me, had any other members of your family gone to college, Mayor?
They had gone to Howard, and tell you the truth, Betty and I, my sister and I don't think we applied any place but Howard. So it was a good thing they said yes. Okay. And then I stayed for law school. I did think about it, when I was at Howard, a lot of the white institutions were beginning to court Black students, especially if you were strong academically. So I did do a summer at Harvard, and I enjoyed it too. They were trying to court you for graduate programs or professional schools, and Columbia, Stanford, Duke, they were all trying to court me and a few others to come to their school. And I did think about going, where did I think about going? Stanford. But ultimately decided, no, Howard at that time, it would be a free ride in the terms of money for law school. And there was a question still in my mind about what opportunities would exist for a Black woman as a lawyer. And I was getting married, and my husband to be was coming back to DC. So I just stayed at Howard. And Howard sort of automatic, from birth to preschool to undergrad to law school. It just kept staying with Howard.
All right. So you're there at Howard, undergraduate, law school. Tell me about your sense of, obviously the 60s is a very dramatic time. 65, the assassination of Malcolm X. So let's start with there. Prior to the assassination of Malcolm X, do you recall, Mayor, what sort of your impressions were, hopes were for being Black in America?
I look back at some of my classmates and I think, gosh, they were really much more cutting edge than I. I was always so absorbed with DC that I was almost myopic about it. You know what I mean? But what did I think about our hopes and aspirations, or what were they? I thought it was going to be a fight. And I was right. I thought there was going to be a fight, that America just wasn't going to respect us. Fortunately, I was in a space at Howard just with enormous talent, and my, classmates, upperclassmen, the teachers, just incredible people. But you just knew we were headed for a fight. And that energy was in the air. There's no question about it. People were trying to be pragmatic. Especially since we knew that what kind of environment we were in, but there was a slight door that had been gone ajar, starting with the 54 decision that my classmates and I were trying to push through. Lyndon Johnson was the speaker at my graduation from college. And in that speech, and I remember it so vividly, he talked about that 1965 Voting Rights Act. And I thought, hallelujah, because then we have an or in the mainstream. We had no power. We had no money. we, in this capitalist system, it was clear we had nothing, and we were the capital for a long time in that system. So we needed political power. That was obvious to me. And I guess I want us to have some power. And with the Voting Rights Act, that was golden. And so that's what I was thinking about when I went to Howard Law School. Frank Reeves was one of my professors, and he was the founder of the key founder of the Joint Center for Political Economic Studies. And he hired me. I don't think I did it full time. I'm trying to remember, because I think by the time I graduated from Howard, I was pregnant. I had married and was pregnant. But to the Joint Center for Political Economic Studies. And it was just unbelievably exciting. There couldn't have been more than 400 elected officials, Black officials in America, mostly in positions that of little consequence. But within the space of 10 years, that just exponentially exploded. It was just wonderful. And that's where I think, I've always would, focus more on how do we get a hook in this system? How do we get some leverage in this system? And eventually political, eventually all of our community, I shouldn't say that, but the people recognize that, including those who were coming out of the civil rights movement, as reflected by DC. We had almost all of our initial elected officials were products of the civil rights movement, be it Marion, John Wilson, out of SNCC, Eleanor, or Walter Fauntroy with SCLC. And eventually and then I got involved with on the national scene. And, most of us who were involved on the national scene were leveraging also our brothers and sisters who had organizational skills from the civil rights movement. And that's what Jesse, would bring eventually as he shook the party in 84, I guess it was in 88. So in answer to your question, yes, I was always focused on it. It's interesting. I asked myself that because I've interviewed a lot of people who were in my class, who like Cortland Cox and others who, went on the front lines of the Freedom, Riders and SNCC and so forth. And I wonder now, why didn't I? But I was, again, so consumed with politics, so consumed with DC empowerment, and consumed with focusing on strategies that would allow us to amass that power. And that has been my, particular focus.
So then going back then to Malcolm X, you're saying that you were so focused on DC that I don't want to.
Oh yeah, well, I mean, everybody loved Malcolm X. We loved his way he put it out there. I mean, he was such a man, and he was so wonderfully assertive, and it was very upsetting. I think obviously in the 60s, the students, even though King was wonderful, and I can remember when King came to Howard's campus and spoke at Crampton Auditorium, I felt like I just heard a Beethoven of oration. I'd never in my life before or since have heard anyone so perfect, who was such a perfect pitch in terms of inspiring people in saying something. I never ever, he was, far, in my opinion, even better than what his great speech at the march. But yes, by and large, I'd say the students were much more excited, as was I, by Malcolm, because he just put it out there. Hey, we will do it by whatever means necessary. Basically, as I said, I knew we were going to have to fight.
Yeah.
We're going to have to fight.
How popular was the Nation of Islam at Howard at that time, Mayor? Do you recall?
I don't think I don't recall the Nation. There was an element of it, and certainly I got to know it when I got involved in politics. But when there was more of an avenue by which to do it in DC. But I don't remember. Maybe I missed it, but I don't remember, because Howard is such, with Rankin Chapel and every minister from the Baptist Church and AME coming to Howard's campus. It was overwhelming. That was such a part of the defining experience at Howard, that I don't remember
Yeah. No, thank you.
the
So,
nation having that much of a presence.
okay. So let's move forward to the assassination of Dr. King. You go back, your father has the champagne in 1954. You talked about, you knew there was going to be a fight, but the Voting Rights Act in 65, gave, a sense of promise. The assassination, well, we can even go back to President Kennedy. So you can go either way you'd like.
Mhm.
But what is that sort of, whether it's Kennedy, then it's Bobby Kennedy, it's Dr. King, where does that leave you in feeling where you were as a Black American mayor?
Well, it was such a great sense of despair, but also I'd say what eclipsed that, I hate to say it, was anger. I mean, this was such a spiritual man. I mean, not just in terms of his profession, but in terms of his energy. And that America was so cruel and ugly that they would do this. There was a lot of anger. And as you know, I mean, DC had riots and, things getting burned down, as did so many other major cities. Anger, I would say, is it anger. They just forget it. America just is never going to do the right thing. And that we need to figure out, unfortunately, a question we still ask in 2022. How do we ever achieve any reconciliation on these issues?
Mhm.
The political, cultural fault line of this country is based on race-based was slavery and its vestiges, and it still exists in 2022. And I just think there was just anger and trying to figure out how to direct that anger, how to direct that impatience. How do we get beyond this? Because, you know, we weren't going to take it anymore.
Yeah.
At least our generation felt we were not going to take it anymore. We had to figure it out.
Did you get that kind of sense with the assassination of President Kennedy, Mayor?
Well, I think that was the beginning of feeling a great sense of loss because he did represent hope. And I mean, that's when in high school I got so excited when he was the candidate. He came to Howard's campus, he and the first lady, and there was hope because it was a new generation. He'd said the torch had been passed. And I think a lot of people felt because he had begun, a little timidly, but he did begin to address and speak about, racial justice in America. And I think we all felt that was the reason that's always the linchpin in America. And so, but it wasn't. It was a great sense of loss. Everybody was transfixed by what was going on television. You couldn't do anything except watch it.
Yeah.
But by the time you got to King, you were saying, hey, I'm mad as hell and I'm just not taking this anymore. This is ridiculous.
Did there seem to be, after the assassination of Dr. King, it's a short period between King and the assassination of Bobby Kennedy in June of 68. Was there some kind of hope in terms of Bobby Kennedy, Mayor?
Well, I had hope for Bobby Kennedy, but I had just said to a few of my friends that night before, I said, I hope he doesn't win the California primary because I think they'll kill him. Hmm. And unfortunately, that's what happened.
Yeah.
I did feel they would kill him. Wow. And they did.
Yeah. That's got to be, I mean, because you're basically around 24. I mean, so young, and to have gone all through this and your generation, it's amazing that despair, and you talk about anger, just didn't totally overcome that generation because you had so much apparent hope, right? And that things were going to be better. And then all of a sudden, and for you to have, a thought that he would be assassinated, that's a bad feeling to have, isn't it?
It is a bad feeling to have. And but there was sort of a mix, again, sort of like elementary school. There was a part of you where they're going to try to beat you up, another part of you where you figure I can get through the door, because they asked me to give the, graduation speech. And I think that's how so many of my peers felt. Okay, I'm going to find a way to come after them, but I'm also getting through the door, because we got this limited window, which it was a very limited window of, affirmative action and so forth. 35 years of that. We've got this limited window, and we're going to get through the daggone door. We're going to get into positions of more power. We're going to get to those levers of power. There were some people who were just happy to be there and sit by the door, but I'd say the lion's share of people wanted to get to the levers of power, and they were determined to do it. Because we're in a country that is a capitalist country, basically dominated still by white men. And we had to figure out how to move in that environment so that we too could get to some levers of power. And I think that was the shared thinking. We were fully aware that we were in America, but I think there was a notion of being strategic.
Yeah. And in 68, is your father still alive, Mayor?
Yes, my father didn't die until after I was elected to mayor.
Okay. So do you recall, again, going back to that, popping that bottle of champagne in 54, and now 14 years later, everything that's gone on, do you sort of remember, was he sort of melancholy? What was his state of mind, his generation, do you think, especially those who grew up in DC?
Well, I think my grandmother was still living then, and my father and so forth. Nobody is surprised at what happens to a Black person in America. I mean, you really have to be, out of it, not to expect some of this, And I think there was a great sense of, disappointment, hoping that things would get better, but not surprised. Okay. So, I guess the grandmother, my father, they weren't, this is what you can expect, but we're still going to make it.
Yeah.
Saying this sort of you think of our ancestors, what the heck they went through, but we're still going to make it. We're just determined to make it, because we helped build this daggone country. And we were in a city where we were approaching the majority, and we helped to build that city. And we were determined, I'll be daggone, we're going to stay here and fight for what is ours.
Okay. So in 1968, where are you? Are you finishing up law school?
I'm just finishing law school.
Okay. And what is and you have a child?
I have 2 daughters, grown daughters, and now 3 grandchildren.
Okay, but no, it's in 68.
Oh, at that point, yeah. I had, I didn't, I was pregnant, but I didn't deliver until later, after I graduated.
All right. So what are you thinking when you graduate Howard Law School? What do you want to do? Where do you want to go?
Something in politics, which is why I'm so glad that Frank Reeves, gave me that job at the Joint Center of Political Studies. My father didn't understand why I was so focused on politics. He wanted me to come practice law, which I tried to do, which didn't excite me the way it excited him. But yeah, there's no question. I was totally focused on politics. And now that, come on, now 3 years after Lyndon Johnson talked about a Voting Rights Act, I was with that program. I was determined, one, to get some kind of voting prerogatives for the district, and secondly, to find a way to get involved in politics in America. Because to me, it's power. You've got to have some power, and that's what fascinated me.
Okay, and then how long did you stay there, Mayor?
I was at the Joint Center maybe a year or so.
Okay.
I was trying to balance, by then having a child and staying involved. So I didn't really start working in any significant way until early 70s.
Okay.
But I did stay there for a year, stayed always on top of it. I was so excited about it. And the Joint Center was sort of at the apex of everything. It really was. And I think the Ford Foundation provided the money for the Joint Center, recognizing that this was a seismic kind of initiative. They'd had the 15th Amendment, but Jim Crow took care of that. So the 65 Voting Rights Act was really it proved to be, I think, the most transformative civil rights legislation in America.
So my last question for today, Mayor, is because you've mentioned Franklin Reeves. Can you talk about how important he was to you and to the Joint Center?
Oh, he was very important. Of course, he and Herbert Reed and all of them were constantly in court. Sometimes we were a little annoyed as students when they would come back to class, but they were always in court, on some constitutional law question. But no, he was very important. He had a real vision, and he had a sense of political possibilities. I mean, you had a few elected officials in the country, but so he was, a significant player, and I was grateful that he took an interest in me. He saw that I was very focused on politics, and maybe that's why I got the opportunity. I was a pretty good student. I was on the law review at Howard, but it is, when I think back on it, I guess he did recognize that, because he did pick me for that opportunity, and I was thrilled. I mean, for the first time, I could do something, really do something connected with it. I got to meet the people out here who would already knew this was the way to go. People getting elected, whether it was some county thing or township, but they got it. They knew this was the way to go.
Okay. No, well, thank you, Mayor. And I would love to get a chance, in the near
I look forward to it. I do again. Apologize for any.
Right. And I think I don't know whether you knew my father. My father was the co-founder of Africare, Dr. Joe Kennedy.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah. Okay.
Oh, what a great man.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, Africare is so wonderful, and I got to know him and C. Payne Lucas, and
Yeah, unfortunately, I said unfortunately they closed their doors. I'm glad my father.
Yeah, I know. Robert Mallett, who worked for me, was the last one there.
Yes.
But when I was, what was I active with? I can't remember. What was it? Jack and Jill's got me involved with something. Okay. And I said, now we're going to have C. Payne Lucas come and explain to you all what we need, how we need to think about our place with the African diaspora. They thought I'd kind of lost it, but your father was a very important man, and yeah, that's so very nice.
Yeah, well, our nonprofit is based on him. He was my hero, role model, and best friend, and it's the next generation of family, because this is a family nonprofit. Keeping on telling me his stories, our stories.
Yeah.
And it's it's this as well as I do, because we just talked about this, and so many people think we arrived as slaves and then ended up to be LeBron James, and there's nothing in between.
Yeah.
And that's right. We as Black Americans, we built this country. The American story is the Black American story,
without a doubt. And I have always hoped that we as a collective would tap into throughout the diaspora. And I got involved with the African Union even. I even went to Libya,
okay.
When Gaddafi with his crazy self hosted, a gathering.
Yeah.
And because, and all that wealth we have in Africa that nobody has access to. But, the Africare understood that early on. And, we're still trying to find a way to, again, leverage our power, leverage our power. And so good for your dad.
This is the Black Experience for all. If you like what you hear at the Black Experience, please consider clicking on the join button to support our nonprofit. I'm Adam P. Kennedy. Thank you for joining us.